You spoke earlier and said that you'd been sort of on various occasions back to Amsterdam and to Germany and places. How do you now feel about sort of visiting those places?
Well, Amsterdam, for many, many years I didn't go there. And whenever I did go, I felt very, very emotional, you know. But, you know, you accept situations. And especially after Otto died, I've been going much more often to the house. I speak there quite a lot as well. And Germany, you know, as I said to you, my husband's family went to Israel, Palestine actually, and when we moved to England, his mother moved back to Germany because she wanted to be near him. She was a widow, and into Munich, and I had to visit her sometimes, which was awful, you know, especially in the 50s and 60s, when so Germany is my, excuse me, German is my mother tongue, but when I heard German speak, I cringed, you know, and especially in Munich when there still were those little hats with the feathers, and it was still very German. I really felt awful. But, you know, now it's 80 years after, and from the 40s even longer, and 2, 3 new generations, and I have many, many young German friends. They are very, very sorry about what has happened. And with the film crew, which I went now, you know, they were crying when they were in Auschwitz. And, you know, and they always ask me, can you forgive me? And I said, well, it has nothing to do with you. You were not born. You can't blame people who had nothing to do with it. The old generation I've never forgiven. I don't want to forgive. But the new ones, the new Germans who, most of them are joy. And you know, Germany is the least anti-Semitic country now in the world.
Sorry, you said earlier that there'd been a real change, particularly recently, in terms of sort of how it's covered in Germany and things.
In terms of?
In terms of sort of interest in studying it in Germany. Do you sort of see any kind of sort of defining moment for that change, or is that sort of a generational thing?
Well, I think, you know, the newer generations, because the perpetrators never told their children, and the children very often asked, what did you do, and so on, and they didn't want to talk about it. So their children, again, never heard anything. The children might have even lived where young people, when they lived in the war, but the next generation doesn't really know anything, and they really want to know what has happened. It's, after all, their history.
Have your family developed their creative side passed on from your brother? And do you see your family painting or writing? Have they gone on to pursue that talent?
Well, unfortunately, they all did play musical instruments, but nobody has made anything out of it. They all like painting, but not, again, nobody has made a career out of it or anything. And in poetry, the latest 2 granddaughters are all very keen in poetry, and has poetry, even the youngest is 18, she has poetry being published, and she wants to become a poet. So there is something artistic in them.
Looking back, with more and more research coming out over the last sort of 10, 15 years, does it sort of shock you, the degree of cruelty that was shown by so many women, both in the concentration camps, in their roles as nurses, and the cruelty that they showed towards Jewish people, particularly as they were mothers and grandmothers and mothers themselves?
Well, the women guards were actually even worse than the men. And of course, we in Birkenau had a lot of women guards.
When your children eventually heard what happened to you during the war years, how did they react?
You know, when I wrote the first book, I gave it to them, and it's dedicated to them even. And my oldest daughter said, I'm never going to read it. And I was hurt because I thought through reading the book, they can learn what has happened without speaking about it. And once I went one day to her home, and it was lying open in her bedside cabinet. So she did read it, but she didn't want me to know that she knows, and she, the oldest, is very sensitive, and she still doesn't want to speak about anything. You know, now because all this, I'm now quite well known and I have many interviews, and sometimes I want to interview the daughters as well, and the grandchildren even, and she never wants to talk about it. She says that's all private, what they want to know about Otto, their grandfather. She doesn't want to speak about it. She said, that's my grandfather, it's nobody's business how I feel about him. And my youngest daughter, she came out now when, after Auschwitz, my latest book came out, and again, she was interviewed, and she said, well, she was a good mom, but she wasn't mentally not really there for us. And I was shocked. So obviously, they have suffered. And as well, she told me then, you know, it's difficult to talk about it. But now when people started to ask them, she said, you know, Otto always, and I knew that, but I didn't know that it bothered her. When they did something wrong, he was a lovely grandfather, you know, he loved the children. Always he was the first one to show the photos of them. When he did something wrong, he took them aside and said, look, Anne would have done it this way, you shouldn't do it this way. And so Anne was always in the background. And I knew that when they were staying in their house, I always had to be in their bedroom till they were sleeping. They said, it's eerie here with all photos of Anne. And who is Anne? You know, it was like a ghost. So Anne was actually living with us all the time. And me too, I was always introduced as Anne's stepsister. And which was difficult for me as well. You know, I said, well, I'm a person in my own right. And so as I say, I'm still very happy that they had a grandfather and it was wonderful, and I had a stepfather. But it was as well a burden for the whole family, obviously. And there are now a lot of research being done of second generation. And I just heard from a good friend of mine, her husband had died. She was in the camp with me. He was in hiding, and he died now. And their son didn't come to the funeral. They had a bad relationship with the son. When I told this, because my children knew them, said, you see, second generation. So there are problems. And if you experience something like that, obviously, you are difficult in certain respects, which I never realized that I might be difficult, but I must have been. And there was a film as well with a lady and a husband. He was a second generation. He was a survivor. And she says she was not an English lady, Jewish. And she said, it's difficult to live with a survivor. So I don't know. There is definitely some damage done. But to cheer you up now, you know, I'm a very happy person. I love life. I love talking about it, and it, you know, I think it's important. And I think why there's such an interest now as well, that people do realize. In America, and I've just come back from America, I spoke in front of 1,500 people always. You know, the flocks, they want to hear. And said this because we won't be here much longer to talk. So, and I think, you know, people want to still make use of the real information. And what we are all afraid of, I think, you know, there are people who deny the Holocaust, even now. There is so much proof, and we are the living witnesses of it. But when we are not here anymore, I think in 30, 50 years, there will be much more books coming out about that it is exaggeration, it never happened, and so on. And we won't be here to deny that.
And I think to hear people that actually witnessed is so important. And I think for my daughter's generation, she said to me, hopefully if I get to being an old lady, I can tell my children this story. So I think that's important.
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, what is happening now in the world, not about Jewish people, but what is happening in general is terrible again, awful, awful, awful. And so that is why it's very important to learn the history, what has happened, and we must try to avoid things like this happening again, even what is happening now. I hope we do find a solution. Unfortunately, we have no good leader. There's nobody really who really knows how to tackle all these problems. And in America, again, you know, it's again the same like what I mentioned it, the fear of communism. Russia, you know, I think Russia is going to attack any day. Well, Russia, I don't think, has any intention. Russia is a big country, they have enough problems of their own, and America is just, if Russia would do what America is doing, to go in everywhere and fighting and arming, you know, then we would be in trouble. But it's not, Russia hasn't done anything, and that they help the Eastern Ukrainian, I think you can only be pleased about that, because why should those people suffer?
You grew up there, your family roots were there, but you don't talk about going back to Vienna. I was curious whether you have ever been back, and your extended family, what happened to them after the war?
My mother would never set foot in Vienna anymore. She said we were thrown out there, they didn't want us, I won't go there anymore. And my youngest daughter, the funny thing is that lots of my grandchildren and one daughter have studied German. So, you know, we have a Middle European culture, way of life, and that is in your blood. You can't just throw it away. And she wanted to go to Austria and Vienna, and we did go in the 70s. But, you know, I don't know anybody there. All our family, some have been lucky to get out, the rest have been all deported. And I was a child, so I don't know any, you know, it's like a tourist visiting another country. But I must admit, I feel at home there. But I could never go and live there because, as I say, I know nobody at all. But I like the scenery, you know. Dutch people, for instance, Otto took always 4 helpers to Switzerland on holiday, and they got claustrophobic because Holland is so flat. They say, with all those mountains, the feel of, you know. But I just love the mountain because they're in my blood. And but, you know, I live now here, and I'm British, and I got an MBE even, so there is no empire anymore. But, but, you know, you lose your country, and that's it.
Just one thing, you mentioned your husband. Has he got his own story? Has he now opened up to you as to whether anything happened to him?
Well, they went to Palestine in '36. And it was very, very difficult. His father had been, obviously, so 3 years in concentration camp. He died soon. So my husband had to support his mother. He was 14. And at that time in Palestine, you had to pay for your schooling. So they couldn't afford to go to school, so he had to take a job. And then in the '48 war, he was in the army. And so actually in my latest book, After Auschwitz, he writes his own story in it, which is interesting as well.
I'm interested to know how you felt as a young girl being labelled as Jewish. I don't know how Jewish or religious your family were. How did you feel about that?
In Austria?
Or when you came to Holland or in Belgium? How did you feel? Did you have a Jewish background? Did it feel...
Well, we were not very religious, but as I said, in Austria we had religious education, and so we went home to our parents and wanted to keep all the holidays. So we did keep everything. And well, as I say, at first there was nothing wrong in Austria to be Jewish. Everybody accepts there's a big Jewish population, and very successful in part. You know, the whole theater business and and medicine, lots of Jewish doctors and professors, literature in Austria, acting, in music, everything was in Jewish. But as well a very poor Jewish population who had come from Galicia after the First World War. So it was a very mixed society, and that was fine. And in Holland, there was no anti-Semitism whatsoever when we came. On the contrary, Holland had always let in the Inquisitions, Polish and Spanish and Portuguese Jews settled in Holland. And, and in England, after the war, when we came here, no, I didn't experience any anti-Semitism at all.
Do you feel that your being Jewish helped you to get through your experiences?
No. No, I don't think so. But, I mean, you know, and what question always goes up, do you still believe in God and all that? And I said, in the camp, the only thing what we could do and did, and there were, of course, many religious people, was praying. But God didn't answer to stop this, and God didn't. So I came out an atheist. And I was an atheist, I didn't believe in humanity. So, you know, I was miserable, very, very, very miserable. And if you don't believe in anything. And I wanted desperately, when we got married, I wanted desperately to have a family, because partly through, you know, but anyway, I always wanted a big family. And nothing happened, because in the camp, in the liquid we got in the mornings, they told us there was bromide, which stops women to menstruate. So my body was obviously damaged physically, and I was obviously damaged mentally and physically. And so eventually I went to have it checked out, and there was hormone problems, but they could put it right. And then I thought, when I gave birth to my first daughter, that was a miracle. And I started to believe more. And, you know, I'm still questioning. And that is something, you know, I've spoken with rabbis, with priests, with all kinds of people. And really the Chabad Jewish people, I travel a lot with Chabad, give talks. They say, you must not question, you must just accept. Because we will never get an answer. And I realize that, and I do believe in humans. Again, I've met wonderful people all over the world. And I could tell you amazing stories just now when I came back from America, what people did for me. And as well, you know, if you live with a belief, life is much more beautiful and much more acceptable. So I do believe, but I still question.
How did you keep, like, Pesach and, like, festivals that have special food? How did you, like, do that?
How I kept the holidays? Where I couldn't keep it. There was nothing. There was nothing to keep. By the way, we didn't even know when it was. We didn't even know when Shabbat was. Every day was just the same. And certainly you couldn't keep kosher because you ate whatever they gave you, which wasn't much anyway.
I wondered how you felt about people who were survivors who had never found their voice and never been able to speak about their experiences, and whose stories were therefore lost now to the next generation.
Yes, well, that is very often when I speak, somebody from second generation comes forward and says, I wish my mother or father would speak about what has happened, because they want to know. Of course, many now have died, and some stories will be lost forever. That is very, very sad. But I hope that at least the children will try to find out a little bit, at least where they were and what. And as well, you know, in Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Museum in Israel, they want to try to find at least all the 6 million names, because that is very, very important. Like, you know, like my brother, at least he's remembered. Anne says as well in her diary, when I die, she would like to live on. Well, to be remembered, to have left something behind is the best. But when I was in Russia some time ago, we wanted to ask President Putin to put Holocaust Memorial Day as well on his memorial calendar. But he happened to be in St. Petersburg. It was the same day, 27th of January, when the siege of St. Petersburg was broken. So I never got a chance to talk to him. But I met a couple of Russians who were soldiers at the time who liberated the camp. And while we was in Russia, I met some people from Yad Vashem who going still around into Russian and Polish villages to find Christian people who still remember perhaps Jewish families who have been completely disappeared at the time. They just took them out and shot the whole family. And so the names are lost. Try to find those names. And they say each visit they still find 30, 40 names still. There's still some, but of course, you know, all this is left too late. It could have been done much earlier, but people didn't think about it. And that's why I think now people are so interested before it's too late, still to find out as much as they can.
Is there anything specifically that the people who are speaking now, that you do to encourage other survivors who may not have spoken to speak?
Yeah. Yeah, but you know, most of them who are still alive do speak now. But it happens as well with the soldiers who liberated the camps. Don't speak about it, you know, and they should as well talk about it, what they've seen.
Thank you. And thank you.